I spoke at RSA this past spring, and I was the last talk of the conference, and I had this big ballroom. And I was like, 4 people showed up because Alicia Keys was going on like right after my talk. And me being the ever positivity person, I was like, well, what I'm going to take from this is technically I opened up for Alicia Keys. This is not I've given this talk in a similar fashion before. And mostly it was like, and I hear this from people, it's like, they're not really interested in learning about communication. And like, that's the problem, really. But the first time I gave a similar talk, it was mostly about telling people what I thought their problem was. And I had to go back and think about myself. I was like, why did I even first start putting myself out there? And that was really to help people, because I came from absolutely nothing. And there was a lot of people in my life that never thought I would turn out to be anything. And what I did when I first got into security, I had this really contrarian sort of viewpoint. You guys probably have run across some of these people in security where they'll find any excuse not to do something. And it took a while for me to realize that was a protection mechanism, because if I never tried anything, then I would never fail. And then I could just sit up on my high horse and try to flex my technical muscles and talk about all the reasons why you can't do things. And it wasn't until I sort of pivoted that mindset and kind of embracing my failures as options, like opportunities for improvement and learning from all those things, is that like my career kind of took this whole different path. And so instead, I'm going to change this. I'm going to walk you through the path of all of the mistakes that I made on not being bilingual in cybersecurity, why it's so important for everyone in the industry. We need more people who are bilingual. These lights are really bright, but is anyone actually bilingual, like speak multiple languages? My man, have you ever been in between 2 groups of people in which you were the only one that spoke both languages? Would you say, based on your experience, that the success of that conversation depended on you being there?
Yeah.
And would you then say that now you were the most important person in that conversation? Thank you for coming to my TED Talk. That's exactly the point, right? Is like all of this comes down into like, we finally got a seat at the table. And what I'm concerned about is if we don't start becoming bilingual in the industry, is that we're going to lose that seat. And so this is very, very important, because we're kind of in this new era, right? I used to use Mean Girl memes all the time on all of my talks. And then I'm getting older now and they're not landing as well. So I'm shifting over to Taylor Swift ones, which seems to go a lot better. I came up through incident response, right? Did the IR consulting, which, as an aside, is the most insane job I've ever had in my life. If you've ever seen that movie Fury, the Brad Pitt movie, where all in the tanks and they're all looking haggard and they all say it's the best job I ever had, that is exactly how I felt about my career in IR. And so I saw IR go from the carding era, which was point of sales in the 2010s, move into the ransomware era. And what I started to think about that afterwards is that I had this epiphany. It was like, ransomware did more for security than probably anyone in this conference, right? It's because what ransomware did that we all failed to do was effectively communicate a risk based on a threat. Now, if you look at how ransomware attacks happen, they took advantage of everything we've been talking about for the last 20 years. Local admin rights, open SMB shares in between workstations and servers, allowing domain admins to log on to workstations. It was nothing new. And in fact, all of those, like the IRs that I used to work in the 2010s, the big point of sale breaches, same exact attack, right? And it just changed. The target aperture changed to now include everyone. And we took that one big on the chin. And so this was kind of like the thought that started me down this path of like why we need to change all of us. And this was me, mostly. This is me, because I was that guy saying, oh, it's just a bunch of noobs, they don't care, all this kind of stuff, and throw my hands up and walk, like stomp like a toddler down the... I'm like, no, that's not the way to do this. It's our responsibility to be able to understand the threat, communicate that as a form of risk and tell the business leaders why they need to make investments or changes. And so we have to lean on this because we are now presented with an incredible opportunity. And if we don't take advantage of this, I'm scared that we won't get another one like this. So this is how I started. When the first time when I was like charged with owning the detection and response strategy for an MDR service. I used to work at this big corporation, and they were like, "Oh, you know technical stuff, right?" So like, we'll just give it to Dwyer, right? Like I came, IR, and then launched the threat hunting practice with all of our friend Grifter in the past, and I did what everyone else does. You download the spreadsheet from MITRE and then you start making it green, right? Everyone does the green. You start in the top left corner and you go through all the techniques and you start making it green. And then I was like, well, if I just buy EDR and I have my spreadsheet, is that really a strategy? Or am I just playing, MITRE attack bingo, right? And I'm seeing something cool on Twitter and I'm like, oh, we're going to develop a detection for it. Market green. I'm like, well, what is driving that? So I went back in the incident response data, and then through the period of 2018 to 2022, which I would call the biggest, the golden age of ransomware. I think during that time, I think the numbers was just at our firm, something like 755 IRs that we investigated that were ransomware. And in the data, 92% of those ransomware cases, the adversary could have been detected before they stole data or deployed ransomware in a single event log. The system event log 7045, because if it goes in there, you guys have done IR, Cobalt Strike, the privilege escalation, lateral movement will manifest itself in there. So then I was thinking, if I could have got a 92% detection capability just by doing one thing, why am I playing MITRE attack bingo? Why am I making this spreadsheet green? How does this convey any sort of strategy? Because it seems disjointed, and that's because it is, right? So then I had this thought, like Doc Brown falling off of the toilet, Back to the Future. I was like, and by the way, tangentially, I have been wrong so many times in my life. You're not going to offend me if you don't agree with this. The point of what I really want you to take from this is start thinking differently, start being a little creative, and start thinking about what it's like to actually look at a long-term strategy and what an actual strategy is behind a detection and response solution, and come up with one of your own. This is the one that I started with. And I was like, if you think about everything that's going on, we could have this Venn diagram, and in the middle there is what should be driving our detection and response strategy, right? Because we have the impact. If it doesn't impact an organization at all, do we really need to invest time and money into developing a detection for it, or even all the response stuff? Like if we get around to it, that's sick, but who's getting around to the fringe stuff, right? The attacker operations, right? So I go back to the 7045s and I'm like, we all understand how ransomware attacks happen. It is economies at scale. Also, as another tangent, like here we're talking about the opportunity that we have right now. The criminal ecosystem is now economies at scale. So they do the same attack over and over and over again. So we have a really good understanding of attacker operations. So I kind of know how they're going to go about doing what they're doing. I got to make sure that it's relevant to their operations. And finally, I was thinking about exposure. And that's a bad word choice. I think a better word choice for this, again, this is a mistake. Like, I'll own that. But this is like V1 of what I went through as I was going through this. But it was more like likelihood, right? How likely would this attack be successful given the deployment of our organization? And would it still have that high of an impact? And in the middle there seems like a lot better of a way to go about conveying what our detection and response strategy, rather than just throwing out technique IDs. Because if you've ever briefed executives and are talking about what are you doing on a day-to-day basis, and you start talking about MITRE attack technique IDs in your spreadsheet, you might as well be speaking Klingon, right? They're going to tune out and they're going to go and they're going to flip through emails on your phone and you've lost, right? You've already lost them. If you don't have an executive, here, pro tip, someone who has lost more executives than I can ever account. If you don't get an executive in the first 5 minutes of whatever you're briefing, you've lost them the whole time, right? So this is why we need to be bilingual. We got to learn how to communicate. We got to be able to be that person in between the technical and the business teams because you need to get them. You got to get them on the hook so you can enact the real change. So, showed you this kind of example. Another mistake that I made, and probably a lot of other people, was, do you guys remember the whole move it thing? Go anywhere. All the MFTs that got popped over the last, what was it, 2020 to 2023-ish? There was like a series of them that happened. Now, I had been doing IR threat hunting, pen testing for many, many years. At no point had anyone come to me and say, we need to design an attack around our MFT solution. It was not on anyone's crown jewels. It was a complete blind spot to me. Whenever these started getting popped, I was like, what is an MFT? And B, why these things? Why are 2,000 organizations getting popped in 48 hours and the world is burning to the ground? So I was like, okay, let's take our attacker operations for what we know criminals do, right? Oh, also, if you've never seen me talk before, I'm going to be all over the place. I don't want you guys to ever get the same talk twice. So we're going to be, but this is an interesting thought in terms of going with MITRE ATT&CK bingo versus the Venn diagram, which I don't have a good name for because I've already trashed it. But when I was looking at the detections that we had built, and I take this attacker operations, 75 to 80% of them were in the first two stages of this attacker chain, right? Initial access, so many detections looking for phishing, so many things like, if Office spawns this, and then there's a living off the land chain off of there, and then it makes a network connection. Spent months and months building all those out. Then, if I get that in a different perspective, and I say, okay, let's look at these stages. At what point does the organization start to assume risk? Anyone want to take a guess? Someone take. Tony, what do you think?
Good question.
There's no wrong answer, by the way. But if you look at this and say, as soon as they access data, right? As soon as they start to get something in which they can use as leverage against you to elicit a payment, you have now assumed risk. Those first three stages are an incident. It's a bad day, but it's not a crisis, right? So if I'm using my new diagram here, I would have made sure that I buttoned up the high risk stuff to my organization first rather than focusing on initial access. Does that make sense? You see, there was a paradigm shift in my head. And I was like, I got to think about this a lot differently. And I need to think about it more out of my lens of what's cool in security and what actually matters, right? Because at the end of the day, effectiveness is what matters. Effectiveness is what is going to get you promoted, and effectiveness is what's going to get you more investment for your teams, right? So looking at this and use our Venn diagram, you're like, of course MFTs would be a valuable target, because if you look at what an MFT is, and I had to do research for the young people in the crowd, before MFTs, which if you don't know, they're managed file transfer solutions, and they meant to facilitate data communications between third parties, right? So before that, we used to just spin up FTP servers all the time, and just let them hang out on the internet. MFTs came around no, let's consolidate those, put some security around them, access control, all this kind of stuff, which those are generally a really good thing for security. So if you look at the attacker operations, if I want to steal data to extort you, well, MFTs already are transmitting and collecting data between third parties, automatically sensitive. You look at the stuff that goes in there, it's orders, sales information, partnership information, documents exchanged between attorneys and clients, all this kind of stuff. It's high value data. And I don't have to go anywhere else. If I get access to that, I steal the data and now I can extort you. So if you look at it in terms of the Venn diagram, this makes complete sense. But it wasn't on anyone's real radar unless I missed something, no one was really talking about it. So that's when I knew I was kind of on to something new. So it doesn't have to be the right way, but it was something new, and it was a new way that made more sense. And when I used that Venn diagram to communicate with executives, it landed, right? Because if we do something like this, we can start, executives love a quad chart, FYI. We can start doing a heat map, right? And they all understand. They don't need to know what an MFT is. They don't need to know email gateway or your email. They don't need to know, but they know top right is the most important. This is a pro tip too, in terms of being bilingual, is learning how to communicate across mediums that everyone understands. And we can start to plot like your exposure, impact, and attacker operations using this. And you get prioritization in terms of what you're going to start building a detection and response strategy about. This was good. This was a really good step in the right direction for me. But the thing that I started realizing here is that while this would help me prioritize, it didn't really do anything in terms of relevancy, right? Because that's the other piece of this, is we want to ensure we only have so many resources, and everyone's resources are getting smaller and smaller, is that we have to make sure that anything that we're behind our detection and response strategy should be like effective, relevant, realistic, right? We use that to drive that. And so I looked at this and I was like, this is a good step in the right direction, but I didn't hit the mark. I didn't really get everything I needed out of this. So then I went back and I was thinking about this some more, and there was, again, the Move It thing, and I was looking through all the other mass exploitation events over the years. And then I started noticing, just because I'm a criminally bad nerd, reading all of the CISA sort of advisories about mass exploitation events. And I started tracking, what did they do post-exploitation? So different software, different exploitation techniques, different attacker operations, and then they kept on doing the same thing, right? They would drop a web shell, they would run some living off the land thing to drop an implant, they would create a user account, or they would steal data. Almost all of them. So I was like, why is that so weird to me? Like, why is this such a foreign concept? Because I had been beaten into my brain, security people, be technical, always look at the cool new malware, always look at the cool new exploits, who's doing what to bypass what, and then, do scramble, right? Scramble, because we do this thing, and I'm guilty of this myself. If you guys have written blogs, you've probably done this, or you've read it a million times. We've seen it all over the place in the ever-evolving threat landscape, in the ever-changing threat landscape, in the increasingly sophisticated attacker, right? How many blogs start like that? You guys know that I'm right here. And then you guys ever seen that meme on Instagram where it's like, really? Is it really? Is the threat landscape really changing that much? Or are we just depicting it the wrong way? Because if we're always chasing MITRE attack techniques, it can look chaotic. It can look like it always changes. But if we take that and instead, let's leave the technical bits out of that. Let me just align the goals and the objectives of the adversary to a threat. Well, geez, when's the last time this changed? These are I've been in the game for a long time. Business email compromise, ransomware, data theft, cryptojacking, top 4 across the board of threats that impact organizations. That hasn't changed. It hasn't changed in a long time. And we have some consistency now that we can actually build a strategy around. And like, our detection and response strategy are going to be aligned with the adversary's goals and objectives. I'll give you an example of when this has happened. If you look at massive changes in the threat landscape, and I remember another mistake, completely got pants during this incident. And this was, you guys remember banking Trojans, the trick bots, the Drydex, the Emotets? Worked so many banking Trojan outbreaks in my time in incident response. Now, it was a pain in the butt. It was an incident, but there weren't people spinning up 24/7 war rooms to do banking Trojan incident response. It was something we're like, okay, let's get the tech deployed. We'll get this container remediated because the risk to the organization pretty minimal, right? The risk would have been to me. Like, I get infected by Emotet, my banking creds get stolen, and they drain my bank account. But the enterprise, they're like, that sucks, bro. But like, it's not, the world isn't burning down. Now, take the goals and the objectives. All it took was a change in objective for banking Trojans, and the whole world burnt to the ground. They went from the objective to stealing banking credentials to being an access broker, and we all got hit in the face. I remember the first incident that I ever worked where I saw a banking Trojan become an access broker, and we had no idea what was going on. So if we use the goals and the objectives as our guiding light for our detection strategy, we actually have something we can lean back against it. Everyone understands insecurity and not. This, if anyone has ever done any sort of business, is going to be based around the GOST model. If you haven't seen it, most business people know what it means. Goals, objectives, strategy, and tactics. We'll jump into tactics later. But if I go, security person or business person comes to me and be like, hey, give me a threat landscape update. It hasn't changed. This is it. This is what we're aligned with. This is what we're battling. You know, when this changes, we'll let you know. And it's going to be a big, bad day. But this is what we're using to drive our strategy, is we're aligning to the goals and the objectives of the adversary. Same thing happened kind of with ransomware too, right? Carding era, steal credit card data, same threat actors moved into extortion-based attacks, and we all took one on the chin, right? So we got to look for those in terms of pivoting and threat. Got one more tangent. How many of you in security have been asked about how attackers are going to use AI? Raise your hands. If you don't raise your hand, don't lie to me. This is going to be interactive one way or the other. What is the number one thing that everyone says? How are attackers going to use AI? Creating malware, one of them. Boom. Sending phishing emails. If your strategy is based on this, who gives a crap if a computer wrote a phishing email or a human did? Does it change their goals and the objectives? No. We're talking about an element of scale, but bad news, guys. We've been in the element of scale for 25 years with phishing. You can buy a business email compromise platform right now, and it does the whole thing for you. Spins up your infrastructure, has the MFA bypasses, does the whole thing. It costs like $45 if you want to just send a few. You know, they've taken the enterprise model where it's consumption-based. The more you send, the more that you have to pay, because it's all built on the cloud. So we're already there. So it really doesn't change anything. Now, if they start using AI to do something else, to say, I'm going to develop, maybe, you know, some criminal develops an incredibly charming AI model, and now I can influence other AI models to make decisions on my behalf. Okay, now we have to pivot. But until that happens, we can use this, right? So it doesn't really change anything in terms of our strategy. We don't have to change anything in terms of detection, because a fish is a fish, right? They still have to go through the rest of their attacker operations. If we look at this, we can map this out and say, well, now we have the supporting ecosystems in terms of the threat. And I've seen people make those the same, but they're not really, right? Redline stealer is a big one right now. It's an info stealer, steals a bunch of credentials. It enables a lot of the top level threats, but there's different risks. So if someone steals your credentials and never uses them, where's the risk, right? We have to make sure that we're properly communicating this to the people that sign our checks and invest in our organization, so they understand. Anyone can understand this. Oh, you have a supporting criminal ecosystem that allows the top level threats to be successful? Sick. We don't need to jump into like different malware strains from a business point of view. We have to make sure that it's clear and concise. And aligning to, you don't have to use the GOST model. I found that it's really successful. Pick your other business framework, but using a business framework to describe the criminal threat landscape, 10 out of 10. It is a 10 out of 10. If you find a better one, let me know. Find me out on social media. I'm happy to chat about it. I haven't found a better way to communicate it with non-technical people. There we go. And you can map this out, right? You can see how we can make a chain of goals and objectives. Here's the access broker ecosystem. They make money through selling access. Those are their main strategies to do so. And they have supporting technical pieces underneath there, right? Two slides. You've just described the criminal ecosystem and the threat landscape as it's relevant today. So now with the combining of these two, I felt like this was a good mixture to get relevancy, prioritization, which was really the important parts in terms of driving our strategy. And our strategy is to make sure that we have relevant attacks and we're able to prioritize them associated with something. This was my next mistake. And this mistake, we see it all the time. And every time, you guys, we had Change Healthcare. And then who was the auto dealer that got shut down and like no one was able to buy a car for like a few weeks? Was it AutoCAD? Well, that was a different one. There was another one. I feel like it was a 3-letter thing. But anyway, so they got hit, right? And because they got hit, they downstream stuff couldn't do any business, right? And so that was a massively high impact event. And anytime I see something like that, I feel like this conversation didn't happen. And that's usually the fault of the security people. At least it was for me, right? This was epiphany number 2 in terms of designing a strategy. And this is when being bilingual is the most important, right? And that is the determination of impact, right? We can help sort of like contextualize impact for the business, but the business really needs to be telling us, that needs to be a two-way communication to properly sort of evaluate what the impact is going to be, right? Because if you're not involved in the strategic conversations of the business, how are we going to know what is going to cause the most impact for our organization going forward? Huge, like kind of like eye-opening for me, because this was me in my own little bubble, trying to determine what was the most impactful threat based on what I thought, right? And so looking around and be like, okay, well, ransomware, we're going to be big time endpoint focus. We're going to button all these up. We're going to develop this thing. And then like something like in the cloud happens, right? Exposed S3 buckets get stolen and popped. All that data gets taken away. And I'm like, well, I didn't know about those S3 buckets. And that's because I was in my own little world, right? Talking about what is the business going to be doing next. Didn't have those conversations. Be like, hey, I would like to have 30 minutes of your time twice a week to just talk about business operations that are massively impactful for what we're trying to do as a company. What are you trying to do strategically to make this company successful? Let's talk about what would happen if any one of these threats impacted all those things, right? Kind of like if anyone was in the military, this kind of started from there, but the idea of mission mapping in cyber key terrain as a living and breathing thing, every mission different, right? And we map the people, processes, and technologies that would enable that mission to be successful. This is a constant thing. This is not static. The good news is we have a relatively static threat landscape that we can apply to this. So it's kind of an easy conversation if you go back and think about what is the impact of each one. And I'll show you an example of that. Impact of each one of these threats. How would that apply to what is a high impact event for the organization? And now we're cooking, right? We don't need to dive into the uber technical pieces because that's our job. You need to tell me as a business what's going to be massively impact, because you don't know, at least I didn't know this when The first time I learned this lesson was the company that we were consulting for, and they had contracted out, help me develop their internal SOC. This is our detection and response strategy. It's like, got it. Easy. Nail it. I already had my Venn diagram at this point, and I thought I was the coolest dude on the block. No, bro. Like, I didn't even have a conversation to talk about what they were going to be doing in the next quarter. And they were spinning up like new business initiatives that they had leveraged a lot of the company against. And fortunately, it got caught on a pen test and not on one of these actual attacks. And it was like, so what are you doing? Like, why are we paying you for if you missed something so obvious? And then I got all upset like a toddler again. And so it was, you didn't tell me about it. But like, did I actually go talk to them? Did I take an interest in the business? Just today, was talking, bright young kid, really, really nice guy, and talking about what I was going to talk today. And he's like, oh, you're not talking about anything super technical. And I was like, no, that's not really what I don't think is like the priority right now in terms of cybersecurity. And I was like, if I look at the technical skills out there, I was like, we're pretty good, right? The people on the offensive side are really pushing the limits in terms of what is capable. But if you look at the threat landscape, there's a huge delta, right? We were developing this new, sorry, tangent. How am I on time? Oh, I got 30 minutes. Solid. We're developing this new technology into our product, right? And it was kind of along these same lines. Not to like, gas myself up or anything about, but I took this and I was like, let's kind of boil this down into the goals and the objectives of what adversaries are doing in the real world, right? And how can we do something that's effective for all of these different types of things? And so we're developing this stuff. We called it attack disruption. And you can read about it online if you got anything. But basically, it was like, let's take all the different ways that we know criminals and even some high-skilled APTs or whatever you want to call them nowadays, how are they launching an implant, right? And then we're like, okay, well, how are they doing shellcode execution? Because shellcode execution remains super hot, and even most of the default loaders are, at least the criminals are using default out of the box still. They're not even like doing base 64 encoding on their shellcode. Like, they just run it raw, right? Well, how can we do across, if we know that that's what they're doing, can't we look at and sort of inspect what's happening in terms of shellcode execution and create one detection that will apply to them all? Because until they change what they're doing, why am I going to write 14 different shellcode detections for the 14 different C2 infrastructures that they're using when I know that I can use one? All right. And boiling that down and taking the same approach of like working smarter, not harder, and thinking about what our detection and our strategy is, which is to do as much as possible with the least amount of detections, and using our Venn diagram and our understanding of attackers to drive that. So that was just a side story there. So here is, you probably can't read that, and honestly, it's quite fine if you can, because ChatGPT wrote that. And I was like, give me a GOST model for a new online real estate company who is trying to gain market share with young buyers by having a completely online platform, right? And it gave me this. Now, some of the things in here, old John would have said, nope, we're not doing it. You can't do it. It's a no, bro. Like, I wouldn't do it. If you take that approach, they're going to do it anyway, right? Because as soon as if you say no, you can't do something, they're like, well, we could make $11 billion, so go kick rocks, right? They're going to do it anyway, and now you've taken yourself out of the conversation, and the more times you do that, they're not going to come to you ever again. Being able to understand the GOST model here, also, pro tip, you guys notice I didn't label those, but the top 3 things were the same color, and you probably understood that was the goals, objectives, and strategies there. Use the same colors when you're talking to executives. I don't know why it works that well, but it does. So that's my free advice to you. So instead of looking at this and saying, no, we can't do that because it's too much risk, or you can't do that because it opens up a new attack surface, instead, why don't I say, how do I align with the objectives of the organization and say, okay, understand that we want to do this, but I see that one of your objectives here is to gain trust with potential buyers. So if we implement X, Y, and Z from a control and detection point of view, we can actually tout our detection and response strategy as a value add in terms of like why they should pick our online platform to do it. That's a much easier conversation to have, because then you're looking at security as a value add, as a market separator, rather than a cost center. And you can get your executives and your business leaders to start talking about how awesome our security team is and how they are completely aligned with what we're trying to do as a company and what we can do from there. Like it doesn't take that long. On all it takes is you to try, right? And you may fail, and that's okay. But trying is the best thing that I've ever done in my entire life, is trying. I spent a lot, it's kind of, my factory default settings are being like a piece of trash. Like I did not, like it took me a long time to figure it out, and I didn't really try all that much, mostly out of fear and lack of self-confidence, all these kind of things that, you know, we can delve into that on a couch sometime. But trying was, hey, what's the worst? Like, did you die? Like, what's the worst that's going to happen for you to try? No one's going to get mad at you for trying and being able to actually communicate. I mean, you can't go in there guns blazing and tell them they're all idiots. Obviously, that's part of being bilingual, is to say, I understand what you're trying to do as a company. I need to have this conversation to say, like, how do we align our security strategy with what you're trying to do as a company? Because we want to make sure that we're both successful, right? At the end of the day, the goal of most organizations out there is to make money. So how can we use security as a way so you make more money, right? You say, well, we're not going to lose business. We're going to gain trust. We're going to gain market share because we're going to have the reputation for being a secure, on the leading edge sort of company that does security better than anyone else in the field. And we can tout that, you know, how we don't want to be the company, you know, the kind of state of what it is right now is like, you expect to have your data stolen. What if we never lost our, well, never, I mean, but like, what if we only had one breach in 10 years? Because most organizations, if the IBM cost of the data breach, I think it's 1.2 breaches per year per company. And it was like $4.5 million is the average cost. So most organizations are having one breach a year. What if we could say that we have one every 10 years, right? And this is what we're going to, here's our response strategy to that. If we do that, we have this sort of buttoned up. That's a much easier conversation to have. And we can develop something like this to say, my security strategy, what we're doing in security, we're going to try to directly align with the goals and objectives, strategies, and tactics of the company. And so that we have a measured reduction in impact, right? Because we need to understand what you're trying to do as a business so that we can properly secure it, be involved from the very beginning. Because most, you'll probably agree with me, and this is changing for the most part. It is better than it used to be. In my experience, for the longest part of my career, it would be like, company decides they're going to do something, build a product, they build the product, dev, beta, prod, and then they're like, now secure it, right? And this was the whole DevSecOps mindset that we were all supposed to adopt, except we never involved ourselves in the conversation. We just said, like, if you're not going to do it my way, don't even come here. Same mindset, except it's to people, right? People do drive business and people do drive security, and we need to be the ones to extend the olive branch, right? Because we're the new kid at the table and they've been doing business for 35 years. And they're like, You need to make me understand that. It is our job, right? And this is a skill set that I think is massively under practice in our industry. Super technical people falling out of the woodwork. Technical people who also are good communicators, in my experience, it's not a ton, right? And from a personal standpoint, back to our example of being the most important person in a conversation, if you want to accelerate your career, one of the best skills that you can have is communication, being able to talk to the technical team, communicate what the technical team said to the business leaders, and actually enjoy that conversation. Being involved in the business side of things, being involved in the organization. Guys, if you're just starting out, or maybe you're like, I need to get a promotion, and you can look back and you're like, honestly, I feel like I might be one of those people who's like, we're not going to do that because, there's this edge case where it's not going to work. Instead of like trying to see how, don't let, what's the saying? Don't let perfection be the enemy of progress. We don't want to do that anymore, right? Because we're going to get shut out. So if we take that, here's another pro tip. I put this in here. If you don't have these and you manage a SOC or manage MDR, manage incident response, if you don't have case studies that actually quantify how much money or damage has been observed in the past based on one of our top level threats, we'll start there, and you do work your way down. I'm not just saying that's all you got to do. You start there. Remember, relevancy, prioritization, and you can get down and then once you get that buttoned up, you can start doing some really bleeding edge kind of stuff, but we got to button up that first. Have all of these in your pocket. Take the time. It takes a Google alert and 10 minutes on a Friday to read through all of the different incidents, because, incidents are not running out, they're happening every single day, and there's more regulations that are involved. And so there's a lot more data out there in terms of figuring out what is the dollar amount, what is the legal actions, all of this kind of stuff. When you start getting your threat map out there, whatever one you decide, make sure you have updated case studies that actually talk through. You don't have to have the whole thing, but like these are two real world things that I just pulled off in 5 minutes of Googling on BECs, because if we go back here, one of the strategies here is that they're going to basically do document exchange through emails, which if you haven't bought a house yet, there's a lot of emails that goes on, and it's a target rich environment for business email compromise to reroute payments and things like that. So we have that mapping right there, email to document exchange. So you say business email compromise should be pretty important, right? Maybe if we're doing all cloud, we got our stuff, and we got our Terraform kind of stuff built up, when we get ransomware like that, and that they didn't steal any data, like that sucks, but we can get back up. We should get to that, but really, what are the high impact ones, which would be operational disruption, BEC. If we're trying to gain trust, maybe we should make sure we don't lose people's payments. So we put BEC up to the top, right? All of this has been about strategy and communication in terms of like overall, how do we do it? Now, this was my last, well, probably not my last mistake, but the most recent mistake in terms of this realm. And that was, felt really good about the strategy, felt really good about how to communicate it. But then how do you turn around and say, this strategy has been accepted by the business leaders? How do we implement this so we can take care of the technical team and get the most out of the people? This is the way that I did it. It's not the only way. I found this works fairly well. Again, let me know if you come up with something cooler or better. There's a lot of different solutions out there. But in terms of like, how do you implement this? And it's important to consider implementation in terms of how do you track stuff internally. And I'll get to the why at the end. If we have business email compromise here, this is when we can start rolling in MITRE, right? We are working now in a technical realm where people understand it's not an exhaustive list. Don't at me on that. But like, what techniques sort of align with that threat? What are our data sources going to be required for our detections across there? what is the impact and what are the targets, right? Kind of like driving where this detection is going to be relevant. Because one more tangent. You guys remember the proxy shell, proxy logon stuff, the exchange on-prem 0-day that everyone got popped on? This was in another epiphany when I was going back through those mass exploitation events. Why do we wait to develop a detection into, like, once a vulnerability gets released? If you go back and look at the big ones, Log4j, proxy shell, SolarWinds, if you go back and you're like, all I needed to do was look at the network connected process to see if it was spawning command interpreters. Why did we wait to do that? Right? Just something to think about, right? When you're talking about like a strategy, when you're chasing vulnerabilities and chasing techniques, to start thinking about target systems that would apply to the attacker operations. And if you don't already have detections for W3, WP.exe, spawning command interpreters, please put that on a sticky note to do, right? Because it keeps happening. Go back and, if you don't trust me, go Google it and go back and look at the detection recommendations for the past 10 mass exploitation, big vulnerabilities that came out. And look at the detection guidance and tell me I'm wrong. Because this is for internet facing stuff, but like that kind of how it works, right? How many do we have to have before we start proactively putting detections that align with what we know attackers are going to do? Okay. The bottom thing there, if you're scrolling TikTok, I ask you to pause 1 second. If you take nothing else from me, rambling on about you, it is that bottom bang box. Without a defined threat, there is no meaningful metric that we can derive to explain to the business how much more secure that we are. Right? I don't care, and frankly, the business doesn't care if you have 11 billion detections. Right? Detections for what? And I've seen this in the marketplace a ton, where they're like, oh, we develop 150 million detections every single day. Detections for what? What are you detecting on? Why do I care? You tell me what do I take from that? If we're not aligning a detection to a threat, what good is it? Like, I mean, it might detect stuff, don't get me wrong, but like, how are we supposed to explain to anyone what that detection is used for? How do we evaluate our own selves of how much better are we doing? Tony and I were just talking about like, how do you measure success in your own career? But like, how do you measure success for your detection and response strategy if you're not evaluating it against the threat? This was me making a giant mistake after doing all this work, developing all this stuff, feeling really good about it. And then someone asked me the question, well, how much more secure are we? And I was like, yeah, they didn't have a good metric. So we have to start thinking about how we align stuff. This is when you can start doing, can you guys read that? Not really? I'll make the slides available. You can have them. You can use MITRE if you want to use a MITRE. I'm not dunking on MITRE. I think it's fantastic. You can use MITRE heat maps if you'd like. You can use a spreadsheet, Azure DevOps, whatever it's going to be if you do detections as code. But the important part here is that we are tagging our detections for relevant tools and an associated threat. So we can then pull metrics to say, okay, for enterprise ransomware, Black Suit, they're hot right now, very active. What are we doing against this threat? Well, let me get that CSV for you. I'll show you right now. This is what we have. We have 64 detections that are known associated with Black Suit ransomware. And here's our MITRE heat map, our heat maps, right? And this is our sort of coverage. If we're not doing that, if you're just putting detections out there and tagging it with a MITRE attack technique, like, okay, so you have a lot of technique detections, but what is that for? Where is the impact? What attacker operations, right? How relevant or how realistic is that attack? We have to start thinking about how we control this internally so that whenever you have the fire drill on Friday, when something new goes out, and your boss's boss says, I need a brief on this, you are not going to your team and say, okay, I know you guys are doing 11,000 things. Drop what you're ever doing because now we have to build this brief. So we're designing our detections in terms of how we implement them in preparation to communicate how good they are. This has saved my team so many hours. It's incredible. Like when something new pops up and they want to know what we're doing about it, it's a Python script and it pulls out the heat map. It pulls out the coverage. And then the last thing we do is we're talking about risk, right? A risk scoring. Quantifying risk is very difficult and you can really nerd out on it. I am definitely not an expert about it, but you can develop some rudimentary sort of risk quantification score based on the threat, how you know that threat happens, and how many detections that you have, right? And you can get that sort of score and give yourself some sort of evaluation on how prepared. You low, medium, high, 1 through 5, 1 through 10, a percentage score, whatever works best for you, whatever makes sense for you. Use a different rubric altogether. I don't care. But as long as you're able to pull some sort of easy to understand metric based on what you've done so far is so critically important, right? That's the stuff that's going to get you investment. That's the stuff that's going to get you head count, right? If you're saying, oh, look, this is what we're doing out of the year. We've been able to reduce the risk across these threat types, these adversary groups by 15%. If I had 2 more bodies, we would be able to drop that risk down an additional 35%. Now, I can go back to my case studies and say, with that, whatever money it costs to hire someone, with that headcount, let's say it costs, you hire like rock stars, right? And it's $1 million a year, whatever that number is. Okay, that's $1 million a year. But if I look at what the average cost is to an organization based on one of these threats, you are basically reducing what IBM says it's $4.5 million. So the cost of the data breach is a great thing to cite because it comes out every year. It's updated. $4.5 million for every data breach. I have my case studies, BEC, 60 million pounds, $135 million that was lost. A $1 million investment, now it's a business decision, right? That's come to the table with that. You say, this is why I need, not because everyone's busy. You're never going to get what you need. Maybe if they like you a lot, you could be really charming. I get that. But if you come to them and say, this is how much money is at risk to the organization. These are the direct impacts based on what we're trying to do as a company. I need $1 million to hire people so we can reduce that risk by an additional 35% and mitigate the threat of $60 million or 60 million pounds for a business email compromise. That's a way more productive conversation. And it all takes all of this data and thinking about this long term to get to that place so that you can actually communicate. And you're thinking about it from the standpoint of everything that I'm doing from a technical point of view, I'm designing so I can effectively communicate what we're doing to a non-technical person. And that's really, at the end of the day, what I want everyone to learn. It doesn't have to, like I said, you don't have to take what I do. Take your own. Think about it differently. But I can tell you right now, largely, it took me a long time to sort of figure this out. Now that I feel like I figured it out and I'm seeing success in that, I want to share that because I don't know if everyone's thinking about it the same way. And I want to have more success. I want to see more investment in security. I want to see more people doing and putting out new frameworks and new projects that are directly aligned with making sure security keeps a seat at the table. One of the things here, like the calculated risk there, risk amplifiers is very important to track, right? So even if you, and this kind of spurred out of 2021, we released this thing called the Open Threat Hunting Framework, and it's about launching threat hunting teams. And one of the things was threat hunting metrics. And someone asked, it was if you do a threat hunt and you didn't find anything, was that threat hunt valuable? And initially I was well, how would you actually communicate the value of that? I thought about it a little bit more. One of the things through that was data sources. If I go to run a threat hunt and I can't run that threat hunt because that data source is missing, then if I track that over time, same with detections. I want to do this detection. I've already aligned it with a threat that's relevant and priority for the organization. Over the past 6 months, I haven't been able to write 35 detections or whatever that number is because we don't have that data source. If I look at the other data sources that we have only written one detection for those data sources. I would like to repurpose the budget we have for that one data source to this data source because we'd be able to reduce the risk by X amount percent. That's a conversation that would lead to change because you're coming to them with what they actually need, which is a justification of how this is going to either reduce cost or reduce risk. We have to get down those paths to actually be bilingual in this space because the business leaders are thinking about how do I keep this company profitable so I can pay people's payrolls and we can continue to grow and do all this great stuff. And so you need to make sure that you align security with that mission as the organization. So that's what I got for you. I hope it was informative and I'm happy to chat afterwards, but I cannot stress this enough. And I'm going to continue doing this talk. This is like my mission. It'll be different every single time because you can see my brain goes a million different directions. But, hopefully what I want to see is that this room starts filling up more and more and people start understanding. And I would ask you to start talking to your peers about this kind of stuff and just ask these questions about how we are designing and developing everything that we're security, and are we thinking about how to communicate what it is we're doing as the ultimate goal of everything that we implement. So, do I have a couple minutes? I have a couple minutes. I can take questions if there's any. Question? Don't be shy. So that's a great question. I fundamentally disagree with so many policies that I've written and then advise companies. And one of the things that they say is like, no one's allowed to run offensive tools on their network. I'm like, why aren't you arming the security people with the tools to generate realistic data so that they can develop good detections or IR playbooks off of? So developing their own tools, I think that that's good. And in terms of like understanding the internals of the underlying OS to like develop and discover new telemetry sources, I think that's cool and pretty awesome. It'd be pretty bleeding edge. I don't know. I would say that would be like something after we've buttoned up what we know are threats and then get there. But I would never stand in someone's way that says like, I want to write my own C2 framework so I can understand data sources better.
But
Yeah.
how many books or blogs have helped you with this? And then, they say,
I don't. No, I don't have any books or papers. I will look around. Everything is mostly just trying it and being okay with failing over and over and over again. And like I listened to a lot of Simon Sinek, like the self-help and like self-confidence books, which got me started down this path years ago. It's like, oh, I actually am worthy and all that kind of stuff, which helped significantly. It is mostly just being confident in yourself to say, I'm going to try something and it may not work. And if it doesn't work, that's okay, but at least I tried. I don't know if there's any good books in terms of effective communication strategy. Are you saying we should write a book, Tony?
sure.
There's a lot of battle scars and everything that I have, but like I said, I just want to share it so you guys don't have to go make the same mistakes because I want to see you guys take this 1,000 miles down the road. Cool. All right. Well, if you're shy, I'm happy to chat afterwards, but I appreciate you guys staying. I know it's a long day at the end of the day. So I thank you. Thank you guys very much.